we will, when we begin, open it up and everybody will hear us. Thank you. Good. Thank you, Troy Allen. You can hear the hosts, right? That's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that in the chat. We have 41 and we had 80 registered, so we might just wait until 7:05 and then we'll begin, which is, oh, it's 7:06. So maybe we should just get started. Anybody who decides that they will join, I will continue to admit them.
Okay. Now, can somebody highlight me or? Great. All right. So, please excuse the people coming in, but maybe we should really start. We told people we would start at 7, so I'm going to give our introduction, and hopefully people will be coming in as I read it. So, all right, my name is Fred Nagel, and thank you for joining us today for Children in Detention, an Introduction to No Way to Treat a Child campaign. And thank you to our two panelists, Kwame Holmes, PhD Scholar in Residence, Human Rights Program, Bard College, and Shaina Law, U.S. Advocacy Officer at the Defense for Children International, Palestine. Thanks to the 4 groups who sponsored this event, that's Jewish Voice for Peace, Hudson Valley, Middle East Crisis Response, Veterans for Peace, Women in Black, New Pulse. And thanks to other groups that have come together to tell their members about this event and to support us in other ways. So thank you. A little history. We came up with the idea of the meeting our local House Representative Antonio Delgado about what we thought was systemic mistreatment, abuse, arrest of Palestinian youths. And we scheduled a time with him several months in advance. In our preparation for the meeting, we started a petition urging him to become a co-sponsor of House Resolution 2407 that ended U.S. military sales to countries that abuse children. We also attended some of his local town meetings. We were lucky enough to be called on. Several of us asked questions, and they were about Palestinian rights and the treatment of Palestinian children by Israeli police. Many of us have actually voted for him in the election, and we're hoping that he would actually come out with a progressive stance on Palestinian human rights. But his town hall answers were not that encouraging. In fact, I asked a question about Palestinian children, and he did nothing but talk about Israel's right to defend itself. And at the end of maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I couldn't remember one time when he even mentioned the Palestinians. Moreover, after these meetings, I don't think it had anything to do with our questions, but Representative Delgado canceled our meeting and said if we wanted to talk to him, it would be through his aide instead. So we decided to make a campaign out of his refusals. We thought he was running away from this issue. Our online petition had reached 2,000 signatures, very close to 2,000, and we asked all our signers to call his D.C. office about H.R. 2407 and urge him to become a sponsor. We also videotaped the statements we were planning to make to him, and we put that online for everybody to see, the 2,000 people. In our campaign to get Representative Delgado to sponsor this legislation that protected children, we came to the realization that we ourselves live in a society that does very similar things to people of color, especially children and young adults. I've worked in public schools most of my career. My one example, I think, was reading about how many police are in the New York City public schools, thousands, and how many arrests and summonses they give. Hundreds and hundreds of arrests are made within that New York City public schools, and 90% of the arrests are black students. And, you know, since I've worked so much in education, I contrast this to the white schools up and down the Hudson Valley. How many white students have been arrested at school? I have only, to my knowledge, only one in a school I worked for was arrested, in fact, in school. So, in fact, this panel is sort of the result of our acknowledgement that racist mistreatment of youth is rampant in both Israel and the United States. And there are connections between them, you know, from the training of police forces to the apartheid nature of both societies. And our hope is that we will come to learn how to really combat racism by understanding these common threads. So we have a little housekeeping. Let me review just briefly what's going to come up. After the panelists have made their initial presentations, Margie Leopold will ask some pre-written questions of the panel. Then Felice Gelman will ask some written questions from your chat list. So if you're interested, down at the bottom there is a chat list. Type your questions in there, and we'll try to get to a lot of the questions before the end. So that's what we're hoping that this is going to be like. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I think we're going to have an interesting and a truly rewarding panel from this. So let's go to our first panelist, Kwame Holmes. Would you join us?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much sorry, this is my opening statement, yes?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm going to echo Fred's acknowledgement of Women in Black, Mideast Crisis, Veterans for Peace, and Jewish Voice for Peace. And I am especially excited to be a part of this because of the real moment of possibility that I think we all are finding ourselves in, unexpected possibility around opposing abusive policing practices and mass incarceration, and thinking about what could be the alternatives for a different type of future. Though I think in order to do that effectively, we have to also look backwards. And I'm a historian by training, and particularly I'm a historian of modern America. And what I've been most interested in is trying to understand what we got right about the civil rights movement, the liberationist movements of the 1960s and 70s, and also how that moment made this one possible, created a set of political trends and cultural hegemonies, you could say, that have made it possible for the police to engage in such intense mistreatment of juveniles, and particularly of African-American minors. So I just wanted to very quickly talk about my broad research project, and which is not in and of itself entirely concerned with juvenile justice, but which has some implications for its application. Again, as I mentioned, I'm interested in understanding the implications, the long implications of the civil rights era. And one thing that I argue in my work is that the civil rights era helps us to understand a huge part of the culture of neoliberalism. And I know that this is a word that is used exhaustingly and can be exhausting to hear over and over again, but I just want to talk very briefly about what it means for me. Neoliberalism being that move towards the marketization, the privatization of public services, right, as a kind of form of governance, but also a cultural move wherein the logics of the market come to be understood as the only acceptable premises for governance, and where market rationality and an emotional rationality in general become the only means to create legitimate political discourse. So what we see emerging out of the civil rights era is the ascendance of African-American, white, gay, and lesbian feminist movements, which are able to achieve all sorts of new access to education, white-collar jobs, positions in government, provided that they operate within a certain emotional bandwidth, a kind of non-strident, rational comportment and set of political demands. And the reason why I've raised that issue is because, and I think why it's so relevant to this topic, is because the moves that are made that I look at in my work that have produced such disparate outcomes in the application of juvenile justice since World War II were, yes, in part predicated on sort of wild racial stereotypes like the super predator, right, which we saw Hillary Clinton's use of that term quoted ad nauseum in 2016, but were also made through very quiet, bureaucratic, administrative processes that were quite invisible to the eye, and which often had to do with how racial minorities were categorized psychologically and emotionally in different ways than white children. And so that sort of interest in the emotional realm as a means of understanding politics and as sort of locating those policies which otherwise are kind of hidden from view is a huge part of my research agenda and what I think I'd like to share more about during the Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kwame. And Shaina, your opening remarks, please, would be great.
Great, thank you. So I echo Kwame's thanks for all the sponsoring groups and for bringing together this group of, what are we at, 49 participants right now. So it's really a pleasure to be virtually with you. I wish I could be upstate in the Hudson Valley and not in Brooklyn, but this is the best we can do for now. So as Fred mentioned in his opening remarks, I work for an organization called Defense for Children International Palestine. We're a local Palestinian human rights organization. I am one of a handful of staff that are located in the US and the UK who support our Palestinian team on the ground in international advocacy efforts. And we've been instrumental in helping Representative McCollum introduce both the previous legislation she had in the past Congress, HR 4391, and this current piece of legislation, which the folks up in the Hudson Valley have been advocating around HR 2407. So I just want to briefly give you a window into kind of what is going on the ground with Palestinian children in detention and give you kind of an understanding of the legal framework that we're operating in. So since Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, there really have been two sets of laws that have been operating at the same time in that territory. There's Israeli civilian law, which applies to Israeli Jewish settlers who are illegally living in the West Bank. And there's military law, which has been imposed on the Palestinians living in the West Bank since we're right at the 53 anniversary just a few days ago with the 6-day war. What this means is that, and just to kind of frame it in terms of thinking about the conversations that are happening in the US right now, those of us that are angry and frustrated about police practices, we're realizing that these decisions are made at a very local level. And so there are efforts being made to put pressure on local leadership to change the laws and change the way that they're applied in order to have more equity. This is not the case in Palestine. In occupied Palestine, military general writes the laws and that's it. children who are arrested in the West Bank are automatically tried in military courts. Military courts are not meant for civilians, let alone civilian children. These are courts where children are deprived of basic due process rights. The child's experience in detention begins at the moment of arrest. In our documentation, and I should have mentioned, we've been representing Palestinian children since 1991. And my boss in Ramallah just told us that we estimate that we've provided legal assistance and legal aid to around 5,000 Palestinian children in those in just under 30 years. So for most children, their arrest begins actually at night. 2/3 of the children we documented last year were arrested in night raids on their homes. So I just watched a Vice News special about Breonna Taylor and saw a video of an execution of a no-knock warrant, and was struck by the similarities in the tactics and the just like devastating impact that it has on a family. That's the moment where a child realizes that their home is not safe and their parents can't do anything to protect them. Children are then bound and blindfolded. Over 95% of children experience this. Their hands are tied behind their backs with zip ties, and then they're taken frequently to a number of stops, Israeli settlements, before they end up at an interrogation center. They have no right to access to counsel when they're being interrogated, no right to have access to their parents when they're being interrogated. Even in the rare cases where children are issued summonses to show up at a military base or an interrogation center, their parents are turned away at the door and the children are brought in. Trials are held in military courts overseen by judges who are impartial. And what we see is widespread ill treatment and even torture of these children, ranging from physical abuse. About 3/4 of the children report some type of physical abuse, either after they've been arrested or during interrogation, psychological abuse, the use of coercions and threats. And most of these children are charged with minor offenses like stone throwing. And they can be arrested not necessarily for having, thrown a stone at a specific time in a specific act, but just on the suspicion that a child may have thrown stones at some point. What we see is, and what we learned through our research when we started representing these children almost 30 years ago, is that we started hearing that we're hearing the same stories over and over and over again about ill treatment, children put in stress positions, children put in solitary confinement where they have no idea what time of day it is, where they're given horrible food to eat and not given proper medical care. And so that's really what led to us evolving from a legal aid organization to doing documentation of these abuses to demonstrate how systematic and widespread and institutionalized they are. I think we're seeing here in the United States, people are finally waking up and realizing that police brutality is not an isolated incident. It's not a bad apple on a police force. It's a culture of impunity that allows law enforcement to abuse their power with, as we saw in the case of George Floyd, where I just read today about the numerous calls to 911, calling the police on the police. There's just no, there's very little means for people to agitate and make change without getting broader support. And that's why we work on the bill in Congress, we engage with UN actors, and we do other things to put pressure on Israeli authorities to end these systematic abuses. So I think I'll end it there and can expand more in the questions. Thank you.
Great. Can everybody hear? Put a note in the chat if you can't hear. We want to make sure everybody can hear, and I'm very sorry if you can't. 5 new messages. Okay, they're not about not being able to hear. Okay, great. Thank you, Shaina. So I have some questions for both Kwame and Shaina. I'm going to ask them, and then if your questions come in, please put them in the chat. And after these questions for our 2 speakers, I have 3 for each of them, then Felice will pose your questions to Kwame and Shaina. And at the end, we'll have some open discussion. So let's get started. The first question is, Kwame, the history of racism in the United States as a response to juvenile poverty.
I'm now unmuted again. Thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one. As I referenced earlier, the history of sort of racially disparate responses to juvenile poverty and to juvenile delinquency, antisocial behavior, whatever you would call it, is one that still needs to be more understood. And I want to draw everyone's attention to the mid-20th century as a key origin point for this division and how the state responds to juvenile delinquency. Many people, I'm sure, are familiar with the term white flight, a phenomenon that describes white Anglo and second generation European migration out of inner cities and into newly developed federal suburbs. And people are familiar with redlining. This has become more part of our mainstream knowledge in the last decade or so. But one thing that we do pay less attention to is how white flight created divergent and racialized approaches to juvenile antisocial behavior. And I'm just gonna give an example from the Washington DC metro area, which is where I've done a lot of my research. So in the DC metro area, which includes the nation's capital and also the inner ring suburbs, Silver Spring, Greenbelt, Alexandria, Virginia, et cetera, there was a lot of studies which conducted in the early 1970s, which revealed that as white flight was occurring in the 50s and 1960s, that there was 2 sort of geographically distinct responses to antisocial behavior. The majority of inner city children who were arrested in the 50s and 60s were removed from their homes, sent to what we used to call training schools, right, essentially juvenile justice prisons, or they were sent to foster parents outside of the District of Columbia, which severed the relationship between parent and child. And by contrast, the majority of antisocial children in the suburbs were categorized as emotionally disturbed rather than as delinquents. And they were sent to inpatient mental health facilities as close to home as possible, preserving the connection between parents and children. So you can imagine the implications of this. You have one set of kids, there's a treatment approach and a goal to return home, and you have another set of kids where there's punishment and isolation as the response to antisocial behavior. And one of the things that's really important about describing this as a sort of function of white flight and suburbanization is that the pathway a child took through the system was determined by the state's assessment of their home life, the home they would return to, right? And so redlining ensured that more numbers of Black families were renters, living in crowded apartment buildings, often real slums where they're in a constant warfare against rats and other vermin. And often their landlords would be residents of the suburbs. In fact, in my work, I talk about this one Greek family who ran a kind of slum lord ring in DC and also a crime syndicate that distributed heroin and sex workers in the inner city. And so their activities get framed as suburban, right? And the conditions that they create within the inner city become the rationale for the state separation of parent and child at the point of antisocial behavior. And that gets totally invisibilized, right? That relationship between the landlord and the environment, that gets ignored in how the state assesses how to treat antisocial behavior in children. So I saw Jane put in the chat is there different laws for Black and white kids? It's not so much laws, but divergent administrative policies that were determined by how the state decided what kind of families could actually care for delinquent kids and which families couldn't be responsible enough to do so. And that's continued basically to the present day.
So thank you. That's great. I'm just trying to help somebody who's muted, but sorry, everybody. Well, Shaina, I want to ask you the same question, only framed in a slightly different way than Kwame's was. Your question is the history. Share with us something about the history of Palestinian arrests and incarceration as a response to the Palestinian resistance to the occupation. And Shaina,
sorry, I was muted.
Right, there you are. Okay, you're unmuted.
I'm unmuted now. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what I will say is Palestinian children are frequently arrested from places where there is resistance to the occupation, sometimes violent resistance and oftentimes non-violent resistance. And we frequently see that children are arrested where there's friction points between Israeli military or settlement or occupation infrastructure and Palestinian communities. So that's, Palestinian villages and towns that are near Israeli settlements, near the wall or checkpoints, maybe near military bases or in a closed military zone. And so frequently what we see in terms of the arrests, it's not necessarily about the child themselves having committed a crime, but it's about using juvenile detention as a means of controlling entire communities. These arrests have really widespread implications on the family. Like I mentioned earlier, if 2/3 of the children are being arrested at night from their homes, there's likely other children present in those homes too, who not only experience the trauma of an invading army, but also the trauma of losing a sibling. You have parents who feel completely helpless because they're unable to protect their children. And so what we see is that it's not even necessarily that people are resisting in violent means, but that it's in Nabi Saleh, for example, or Belin, when they had very active weekly protests, there were scores of children being arrested, and they were using those arrests on the pretext of maybe accusing a child of throwing a stone to also gather intelligence about the community, find out who is organizing the marches or the protests, who is agitating people and getting people to want to rise up, because they realize that if they quash that, then they quash it all. For Palestinian children and who are detained, obviously it disrupts their schooling as well. We just had a case, I don't think we've published yet on our website, but it's in the works, the news alert. 3 children were arrested in the midst of their final exams in night raids on their homes. These are exams that are necessary for graduating from high school, getting into college, and finding out what course of study you're going to take. And if you fail any day of the tests, you fail the entire thing and you have to start over. So 2 of the boys who were arrested within the last 2 weeks were released today without ever being charged with anything. And so it doesn't matter even if they're resisting or not. In many ways, it's about using detention as a means of control, preventing Palestinians from reaching their full potential, and creating a generation of young, predominantly boys, because girls are very rarely arrested, but boys who return to society unable not unable, but they require a lot of rehabilitation and support in order to reintegrate into society. It's very difficult to return to school. They get behind in their schooling, and then they come back and they're like, why should I be with a bunch of kids younger than me when I'm like a man and have been through prison? And so it's really creating generations of and generational trauma that impacts more than just the 500 to 700 boys who are arrested each year.
Okay, thank you, Shaina. All right, question 2, Kwame. This is the one where I want you to speak for a moment about how the American police and prosecutors justify arresting and prosecuting a disproportionate number of Black and brown youths, mostly for minor offenses.
It's an interesting question. And also just everyone, the sun is setting, and so my lighting is now, I feel like I'm suddenly in a remake of Serpico. I apologize. But I will nonetheless persevere. It's a super interesting question. And it's a funny one because, when it comes to juvenile justice, the question of justification is different than in other areas of criminal law. Like when you think about how the state responds when it sees an adult that it thinks is involved in a criminal activity. A police officer, for example, sees an adult they think is selling drugs or has some reasonable suspicion of a criminal act. Then the law sort of compels a set of procedures like arrest, apprehend, book, set some sort of bail. Maybe there's a mandatory minimum sentence. And so prosecutors and law enforcement and judges can all claim a kind of plausible deniability, like, it's just the law, it compels how the process works. In the case of juvenile justice, there's so much more discretion. So like, for example, only 19 states have a law which explicitly says you can have cash bail in the case of a juvenile criminal case. 9 states outlaw cash bail, and 28 states have no language which either prohibits or allows cash bail. So there's enormous discretion. Can prosecutors, will they charge as an adult? Will they charge as a minor? Will the officer just bring the child home, right? This also speaks to the kind of relationships that they might have with the community. Will they bring them home? Will they arrest them? So because there's so much more discretion in the administration of juvenile justice than in the adult criminal system, it really does actually speak to how the human heart, right, plays out in these decisions. And there's a lot of really interesting work within cultural studies. I strongly recommend a Harvard professor's by the name of Robin Bernstein's book called Racial Innocence. And she goes all the way back to the 19th century. And she talks about how part of this kind of cultural regime of slavery was to imagine the Black child, the enslaved child, as not being able to feel pain. And there's all kinds of cultural products and all kind of messages which reinforce that notion. And one could imagine that when an officer decides to take a Black child to detention rather than to bring them home if they see them engaged in a criminal act, that on some level they are disregarding the fact that, as Shaina points out, this is a super traumatic experience and that it will be scarring, right? They are able to kind of say the pain the child will experience is somehow not legible or important, and it can be, and that society's interests outweigh that pain. And this is also where the question of slavery becomes important because, of course, slavery was a capitalist system, and the kinds of criminalizing policies like stop and frisk, or the intense regulation of subway turnstiles in New York City, the light departs with every moment. Those are about, they're basically like stop loss policies, right? I mean, stop and frisk is about ensuring that neighborhoods don't experience the kind of small time crime, broken windows, vandalism that investors believe drive away potential commercial markets and consumers, the same suburban consumers who had left the city in the 1950s. And so those kinds of practices are designed to maximize the profit of land investors in the city. in the same way that the abuse of an enslaved child in the 19th century was about maximizing the land investors who had planted cotton. So yeah, I think that there's so much overlap between those eras. And so, yes, that's what I think we can say in terms of an explanation. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. As you're speaking, Kwame, I don't know how many other people are re-seeing scenes from 13th, which is now available on Netflix. And you know, your descriptions are so vividly portrayed in that film of young men and the way they're being characterized, especially that they don't feel pain in the same way. It just, you know, it's such a chilling thought. So the question for you, Shaina, again, similar but slightly reframed, is how do Israeli soldiers and prosecutors justify arresting and prosecuting Palestinian youth for crimes such as rock throwing or protesting the occupation? It's the question of justification. How do they do that?
Yeah, well, it's very easy for them to do because they can write, you know, a military general has the authority to write the laws. And so they have the ability to write these laws. As I mentioned, they don't need to have, to arrest a child, they don't need to have specific charges. And so it's frequently kind of based on these loose allegations, you know, you threw stones. We know you threw stones. The child says, no, I didn't. And after a number of hours, you know, when a child is in interrogation, being interrogated by somebody, often probably speaking to them with a funny accent because it's an Israeli speaking in Arabic to them, the child's instinct eventually is to confess regardless of whether or not they've done it. Because they just want to get out of that situation, particularly in cases where the child is put in stress positions tied to low chairs and all of that. So in terms of the justification legally, it's really through the military law that they basically can do what they want and don't need to respect children's due process rights because they don't have any. The other thing that's significant, which I mentioned briefly, is that the judges in these military courts are members of the military. They're dependent on their superiors for promotion. And so, you know, in the American judicial system, we don't think of the prosecutor and the judge being on the same side. The judge is supposed to be an impartial figure who's meant to maintain order and allow both sides to plead their case. And in this case, we don't have that. I want to also mention about the conviction rates in the military courts, which are about 99%. And most children that we represent, and this is where I think we're put in a really difficult position as children's advocates. We are guided by, and part of our global movement of defense for children that we're a part of, is to be guided by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Israel is a signatory to that convention. The International Court of Justice, in their opinion on the wall, reaffirmed what human rights advocates had been saying for a long time, that Israel's obligations under their human rights treaties not only apply inside of the Green Line, but also to the land that Israel occupies. The human rights side of us, there are two things that we consider. One is the best interests of the child must always be taken into consideration, and two, and should be primary, and two, detention should be a last resort. And what we found in these military courts is that the administrative process of taking a child through, you know, all the way through a trial is longer than if the child takes a plea deal. And so many of you might be aware of the Khalif Browder case. He was a child who was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack, which he didn't steal. And he refused to take a plea deal, and he spent years in prison. And finally, a judge released him. And that's kind of the similar situation that our children that we represent would be in. If they didn't plead guilty to, throwing one stone, they would end up even if they took it to trial and were found innocent, they might end up spending more time in an Israeli prison than if we just encourage them to take a plea deal. And so it's a really hard position for us because our hands are tied, and in some ways, we almost have to become complicit in this horrible system in order to protect the children who are currently in prison, but aren't able to do enough to prevent those detentions from happening to children in the future. And so it doesn't really matter whether or not a child has committed a crime. If the Israelis decide that they want to target that child and put them in prison, they'll succeed.
Okay, so many similarities here we're hearing. And the final question is, what is commonly experienced during juvenile incarceration, and what are the outcomes of this experience? And then, of course, what are the alternatives to juvenile incarceration? And that opens us up to this very moment, I think. And this question first to you, Kwame.
Thank you again. And yeah, that was so moving, Shaina. Thank you for your work. Yeah, I mean, on a certain level, I really want to pivot to the question of alternatives. I do feel that everyone here sort of knows what happens, and I think the fact, for example, the citation, Marjorie, of 13th does speak again to the ways in which, thank goodness, there's been a real circulation, a popular circulation of the critiques of mass incarceration and the types of experiences that people have in them and the long-term effects that those can have. The thing that I'm most moved by at the moment is the realm of alternatives. And I just want to talk with people very briefly about a project that I'm helping to organize within Kingston, New York's Mutual Aid project, which we're calling Neighbourhood Pods. Well, what is a neighborhood pod? A neighborhood pod is a set of neighbors, and particularly who've made the decision to trust each other, who've made a decision to be able to be vulnerable enough to each other to say, here's what I might need. Maybe I'm short on food. Maybe I'm short on rent money. Maybe I don't have clothes for my kid, or maybe I have an abundance of these things, and I'm really eager to meet the needs of the people within my neighborhood. And that kind of horizontal distribution of services isn't just about the question of immediate needs. It's also about questions of safety. And the decision that people would make in a neighborhood pod would be to look to each other to help to guarantee safety before reaching out to the police. Because I think that one of the most difficult parts of the attempt to abolish the police is not the question of like, well, if the money leaves the police department, which programs will it go to? Or the question of political will is not like, well, what will happen with the murderers or what have you. I think what's really difficult about being able to even contemplate the idea of abolishing the police is that to do so would mean we would have to step up and kind of grow up, right? And stop allowing the parental figure, whether lionized or resented, we're still attached to it, the parental figure of the police to handle conflict between ourselves and the people in our community. It would mean that even if sports were to come back, it maybe, instead of watching the game, we would have to go to our neighborhood pod meeting or to a local town hall where we adjudicated conflict between each other rather than relying upon the state. Because all of the things which the state does, no matter what our political identification, the state does in our name. Whether we authorize it by voting for conservatives or whether we kind of passively allow it by voting for so-called liberals. There's nothing that happens that we don't allow. And so the neighborhood pod structure is about, on a very small scale, starting to step up to each other, replacing dependence upon the state in as many arenas as possible, including on the question of safety, and replacing it with trust and mutuality, and replacing it with risk. The very same policies which say arrest that kid who's vandalizing the building and charge him with a crime that could send him down the path towards a significant time in prison. Those are about risk management. That because land investors have taken a risk on investment and they want to ensure that they will yield a profit. And on so many areas of life, we've allowed the question of risk to take over our thinking about what we'll do. And so I think we have to be willing to risk that there might be a robbery, and that the response could be, let's just pool our resources to replace that item instead of calling the police. So that's what I would love to talk about more, as much as anyone would like to. I'm happy to post a link. If you live in Kingston, we're doing our first training for pod leaders next Monday. I'll post the link to the website and where you can fill that out. But yeah, I think now is the time for us to grow up and to govern ourselves, and we can complain about the mean parent of the state, or we can do something about it.
I'm just bursting with excitement and feeling about that, Kwame. It's like all of my favorite books, including Woman on the Edge of Time, if anybody here has ever read it. It's very exciting. Shaina, I'm going to ask you, a very similar question. The outcomes of Palestinian juvenile incarceration, we know, are trauma, horrible. So why don't we just sort of move to the opposition to this pattern, to Israeli apartheid, and how do you see the opposition growing? I think you're, I
remuted my.
Okay, you have to do it again.
Yeah, there we go. I think I'm good. Sorry about that. I muted myself while listening to Kwame and forgot all about unmuting myself. Super interesting about the pods. I want to learn more about this, Kwame. So hopefully there will be some questions about it. In terms of, unfortunately, I don't feel like my answer is as optimistic as Kwame's is in terms of having this moment and being able to really, if we can step up to it, make real changes. I think the situation in Palestine is much more difficult, in part because we aren't Israeli, we aren't Palestinian, and we're trying to affect change from afar. But there are things that we can do here in the US to resist this, and say that we don't think that this behavior is acceptable, we don't think this treatment is acceptable, and we don't want to be complicit in it. So most of you probably know, or may know, that each year we, as taxpayers, give $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel. And HR 2407, the piece of legislation that Fred spoke about in his introduction, is really it's the second bill addressing Palestinian children's rights in Congress. And this bill really gives an opportunity to send a message to the Israeli government that this practice isn't acceptable and won't be tolerated. And so first I'll talk a little bit about kind of the architecture of the bill to understand what it actually is calling for. And then I'll talk a little bit about like how we're using this bill in different ways to continue to raise awareness and build support. So 2407 has really two operational parts. The first is an amendment to the Leahy Law, which is a law that basically says that U.S. Assistance cannot go to countries that that commit gross violations of human rights. What this amendment to the Leahy Law does is it basically lists a whole bunch of practices, arrest and detention of children, ill treatment, torture, and it prohibits, it would prohibit if passed, the distribution of any U.S. funds to any military units who are responsible for engaging in any of these prohibited practices. So it would not just apply to Israeli forces, though obviously that's the main goal, and Israel is the only country in the world that automatically and systematically prosecutes children in military courts, but it would apply to other countries that are doing similar, that are receiving U.S. aid and receiving similar support. One kind of particular about the bill that I think there's sometimes is confusion about is it doesn't mean that the $3.8 billion would not go to Israel, but what it would say, for example, is if, you know, the Golani Brigade is the ones responsible for arrest and detention of children, they wouldn't be entitled to any of the materials that the U.S. provides, financial or otherwise. And so the second part of the bill is an authorization for the allocation of funds. It's not actually an allocation of funds, that would be a second bill, but it's the first step in getting money appropriated. And that is for $19 million, which would go to human rights organizations that are monitoring and documenting Palestinian child detention, and also organizations that are providing psychosocial and rehabilitative support to help reintegrate children who have been released from Israeli prisons. The key point with the $19 million, for those of you who are doing advocacy with either Antonio Delgado or reps if you're living in other districts, is that that's really the opportunity when you talk about that $19 million to talk about the human impact on children and on their families and what the arrest experience and detention experience does for them. As of now, we have 24 co-sponsors of 2407. It's about 6 months before the term is over, so we do not think that this bill will pass. But the bill is really an opportunity, it's a vehicle for activists like you to be able to go and sit with a member of Congress, and instead of just saying, I'm concerned about Palestine or I'm concerned about Palestinian rights, to really present a piece of legislation to focus the conversation around and to broaden the conversation that's happening in Congress. I just read today an article that was published, I think yesterday, in Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, about Jamal Bowman, who is challenging Elliot Engel in the Bronx and Westchester. And one of the things that they mentioned in that is that Bowman has come out and been critical of Israel's support for, American support for military support for Israel. And he has committed to signing on to the next piece of legislation that Representative McCollum introduces. And so what we're seeing is that Palestine used to be something that no member of Congress would want to touch. And through this legislation, we're finding opportunities to connect ordinary citizens who care about these issues with their politicians and have a concrete ask to really challenge them on, instead of saying, why are you, just signing your name on the line for every piece of legislation that supports Israel, we can say, why aren't you signing on to a bill that seeks to protect children around the world, not only Palestinian children, but children everywhere? And so these are the opportunities that I see. I do, even though I'm not optimistic about the Israeli government changing its practices right now, I am optimistic about the movement for justice for Palestinians growing in the US, and the moments that we have, how unfortunate that they are, that we're in this moment where we're looking at how messed up the US injustice system is in comparison to, you know, a military occupation system. But I think drawing these parallels and being able to see the same threads of discriminatory policies and using policing and prisons to keep oppressed populations subjugated and oppressed. I think that that's a really important opportunity too, and I do have hope that our movement is growing. So I'll end with that. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Shaina. So there's a couple of hands raised, and what we're doing now with our program is Felice is going to ask the questions that have come up on the chat to our two panelists, and we'll get to the hands raised as well. It's now 8:01, so we're going to be going on for a bit longer, but I think we'll be finished probably by about 8:30, if that feels okay to everybody. Okay, all right, thank you. Felice, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you for the reminder. But well, we have some really good questions, and I think that I'd like to start with a question which came up really sort of towards the beginning of the discussion. And Shaina talked about the fact that there are two sets of laws in Israel, Palestine, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians. Kwame, would you say that it is somewhat effectively the same in the United States, or would you say that it's a different situation?
Oh, I'm unmuted. I would say that there are some really important overlaps. Again, the question of like one set of laws versus another set of laws. I mean, I think the statutes, of course, don't make any reference to racial distinction, but I think what's true is that the imagining of African American youth as somehow an external threat, a foreign threat, which is, I think, animated by discourse like a war on crime, a war on drugs, and the fact that, as people have pointed out, there are decades-long collaborations and trainings between not only Israel and the United States in terms of policing practices, but also the former apartheid regime of South Africa, which also constructed Zulu and Xhosa and other ethnic groups as a foreign other. Like that, I think there are incredible overlaps there as well. You know, the formal structure of a military tribunal is one that we don't see, but we do see people being pressured into plea agreements without proper representation, and the use of violence by officers and guards. Again, the Khalif Browder case is a great example, to compel confessions to criminal acts. And so, yeah, there's a lot of overlap in terms of technique and process and the way those acts are culturally legitimized.
Mm.
Thanks. I think that's a very good way to be thinking about it. Shaina, would you say that in Palestine, that it's the case that children are usually arrested for crimes under the military law that they have committed, or is it more a question of asserting dominance, as our president put it so aptly?
Yeah, I don't think it even matters if the children committed, like, it's possible that children have committed crimes like stone throwing. And that wouldn't surprise me if a child that we represented had thrown a stone at the wall or thrown a stone at a Jeep. But I think the real issue is around the justifications for doing it, which are more about, like I mentioned earlier, control and dominance. And so it's less even about getting a kid to confess than having or holding a child accountable for something that they've done wrong. I don't think that this is a system that is focused on, I mean, certainly not rehabilitation, but I don't think it's about punishing people for anything other than being young and Palestinian and a boy. In the case of the children that we mostly represent, and that it really doesn't matter if a child did it or not, because they'll get a confession or a conviction if that's what they want to do. I think that the case I have to find out a little bit more, but in the case that I mentioned of the two boys that were released today without charge, you know, they had a hearing 5 days ago where the prosecution did not present any charges and asked for an extension to continue holding these children while they investigated. So, I mean, that demonstrates that there wasn't even that they didn't have anything to go on. They didn't have any evidence if they eventually ended up releasing the children, but they were denied bail on that first hearing. And they were just kept in there for the sake of, you know, traumatizing children. One of the things that I also forgot to mention is that we don't know how many children are in detention or arrested each year. The only information that we're able to get is basically a snapshot head count that's done on the last day of each month. So that means that if the Israelis, you know, arrested 50 children on June 14th and released them on June 21st, they would never be included in any data. They wouldn't have been in the May snapshot or the June snapshot. What we do see from those statistics that we get from the Israeli Prison Service is the percentage of children who are serving sentences, who have been convicted, versus the number of children who are denied bail and being held in custody until the conclusion of their legal proceedings. And that number has been around 65% who have not been convicted. So again, you know, Palestinian children are not going to go, they don't have anywhere to go from their homes or villages. They aren't going to flee the country. And so the fact that they're constantly denied bail, you know, for a minor offense like throwing stones, it demonstrates that it's not about holding children to account for acts that they may have done that were wrong, but it's more about just penalizing children for existing.
Right. No, thanks. Thanks for that. So I'm going to ask my question, which was, Kwame, how do you see a process of disentangling the welfare system, the school system, and the courts and police? Because you described a process that really, you know, with many, many administrative decisions manages to achieve racial injustice. And then but it's a system. So how do I understand the idea of changing the role of the police. I understand the idea of dealing with situations more in the community, but how do we disentangle this system, this carceral system?
Okay, I don't want to be no, I guess I do want to be a polemicist. I'm not going to disavow. I want to encourage us to not try and answer that question. I don't think it's a possibility that could that if we could find there'd be a means of untying the knot of something which is like not just intertwined, but like has become truly like a body, like a body of like with multiple organ systems and nervous systems. And how could you like pull out your spine or pull out your nerves? Like you couldn't, you know. So rather than the reason why I think Neighborhood Pods approach or any kind of mutual aid approach or any kind of small scale approach is to enter it with the kind of insane non-concern with the outcome, and to be willing to be completely open-ended about what would happen, because maybe that open-endedness is actually the thing which makes it possible to produce something that's greater than its parts. I mean, I'd love, but also we can talk about policy ideas. I mean, I think that a neighborhood pod approach, as what's happening in Kingston, there's a couple of initiatives that overlap and intersect with each other. There's the pods attempt to reimagine safety, and there are some independent schools which are being developed simultaneously. And in fact, the COVID crisis has meant that the Kingston public school system can't host all the children that it would normally host because of trying to limit the number of kids in a classroom. And there's been some talk on the Common Council of authorizing independent schools who teach a more radical curriculum to get some of those kids to do their coursework there. There's initiatives around transforming defunct kitchens in Kingston into sort of food delivery spots. And so I think what's really important is to be involved in the creation of a different society, and rather than trying to figure out like what's the political or administrative key to unlocking it. And so that was my polemicist response.
All right. So we have a question, which I don't really know that the panelists can answer, but I don't want to not talk about it either. Is there a plan to reach out in a way that invites more participation by people of color in these kinds of conversations? Can we have more diversity in the audience, in the people in the questions, and in the people who are participating? And in a way, that's a question for us as the organizers. And I have to say that it's something that white people are not very good at. I think that it would be fair to say that we made the effort to reach out, but the result shows in a way that we have to do much more. And I would love to hear from anybody who wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I'd love to comment, Felice.
Go ahead.
I think one of the things that and this is a personal thing, not related to my DCI. I'm speaking as Shaina, not as DCIP. But I think the biggest challenge in this moment that we're facing is that our first instinct is that we need more diversity. We need to have Black people and white people coming together in solidarity. and working together. And while to some extent that's true, I think a lot of this falls on us as white people, that it's not, these are conversations that we need to be having on our own, listening to Black voices, but not necessarily having them be present in some of the conversations that we need to have internally. So I think we frequently in Palestine work hear about, there's issues between Israelis and Palestinians. Why don't we just bring them together to talk and everything will be okay? And the reality is, when you're dealing with asymmetrical power, it's not always fair to bring in those people who are oppressed, to have them. Sometimes I feel like and I'm working on checking myself on this, when I'm being a good ally merely to get the approval of Black folks around me. I shouldn't be a good ally because I want my Black friend to think I'm a good person. I should be a good ally because that's the right thing to do. And I don't need a Black person to be there watching me and making sure that I'm standing up to systemic injustice or standing up to white supremacy when I see it. So I'm not necessarily sure that for this audience, that this group necessarily needed to have more variety in the pigmentation of people's skins, because I also think some of these conversations are about how do we stop oppressing Black people or people of color or minorities in our communities. And that doesn't require minorities to do anything, because they're just trying to live their lives. We need to get our boots off their neck. They shouldn't have to be there telling us that.
Yeah, I just wanted, yes, brava, absolutely. Even though I'm a Black person who's now giving you approval, so what's happening? No, I'm just playing. But I absolutely want to second and third that. And I think because I've been thinking this past week, I just was watching this event between these two great young, well, No Name is a young hip hop feminist, and Boots Riley is the exciting leftist filmmaker, and they were talking about Black Lives Matter, and No Name could not get Boots Riley, who's a cis man, to actually articulate sort of what goes on when Black men kill Black trans women or Black cis women. He couldn't articulate a means of talking about it because he could only imagine himself speaking to the racial opposition. He couldn't think about his own implication in things. And so I was left that video thinking, the Black community really has to have a set of internal conversations to prepare for interracial relation. And similarly, the white community has to have a set of intra-racial conversations to prepare. And I think about the kind of lessons of couples therapy, which is you should have your own therapist as an individual in couples therapy, because you have to prepare emotionally to actually be in healthy relation. And it feels like the white community isn't fully prepared to be in healthy relation because they haven't done their work on their own. And